Hi everybody. I want to try and give you an overview of the special session. It's always hard to consolidate an enormous amount of information into a quick overview, so I'm going to do my very best. It was 2 months. It started August 18th. We didn't finish until October 16th. It was an erratic schedule. The governor called a special session for us to consider COVID-related issues, police reform, and the budget. Whenever you have a special session, you have to have a set of rules that you agree upon that dictate the process and procedures for the special session. We didn't have one. The House and the Senate couldn't decide, so there was a lot of non-related issues that were actually included in this session that complicated matters, but it was an unnerving sense of disarray for 2 months. I'll just be candid. And we often didn't know what day we were going to meet, and what the rules were very unclear. So when we look at that overarching, I'll start and say, let me go over a little bit about exactly what I thought was important for special session that was a reflection of a lot of the Facebook Lives we'd had and the conversations we'd had during the many months between spring session and special session. So I carried legislation about telemedicine because I thought that had been a really important bridge that we needed during COVID, and a really new innovation, really not new, but more recently utilized innovation for medicine that I think is going to make a big difference going forward. I carried legislation about data, which is really important because I feel so strongly that the data that we are being reported regularly is not helpful in us deciding how we deal with the things that are epicenter of our lives right now, like our economy and our families' financial security, when we go back to school, all of those kinds of things. And in order to make informed decisions, you have to have good data. So those two bills passed. One was rolled in with another senator's bill. The other stood alone. That was the data bill. The data bill has been signed into law by the governor. The telemedicine bill I expect will be shortly because there was good consensus on that. The rest of the bills I carried were things like, let's measure our kids. We know that they've lost ground academically. If we want to not worry about things like SOLs, but worry about our kids, we need to figure out where they are on the trajectory of learning, and that will give us a starting point so that when we can be more hands-on with them, we can make sure they accelerate and don't actually lose ground. It failed. We had a tax credit for families so that they would have money to pay for childcare, especially under age of 13, because all of a sudden they didn't have school as a safe place for their kids to go. Failed. We wanted to make dual enrollment readily accessible for high schoolers. If they have to be online, why not get a college credit for that? That made sense to me. That failed. So this session that was supposed to be about addressing COVID issues, I'm going to try and look over here and make sure I get on here, because when we look at that and we look at how many COVID-related bills were introduced, and I'm going down to that here again, trying to intersect this data for you, 78 bills about COVID were introduced, only 13 passed. How is that a priority for COVID? Now, maybe they weren't all good, but these were. And these are important, and these are important for all of Virginia, not just the 12th district. We wanted to make sure rapid diagnostic testing was available for high priority populations. We wanted to make sure that people who were working in some aspects of essential services like childcare could get PPE in a facilitated way. That's been a real problem for mental health care providers and PPE. That did not pass. Looking at some of the other things, I co-patroned some bills that I thought were really important, like limiting the governor's powers. He shouldn't be able to function as if it were one arm of government only. There should always be that conflict between two different arms of government, equal but separate. That's how our Constitution is written. We need to have that conversation, because it's in that conversation that we avoid making errors and we do a better job for Virginia. They all died. And you know what? I don't understand that, because that's a bipartisan issue. That is where we are ensuring the arm of government we've been elected to serve in is actually protected and able to provide the representation that it should. So I don't, I would have voted for that regardless of what party the governor was in, even if he were in mine, and I think the Democrats should have too. So we had some other things about reporting for nursing homes. We found out how important that was. We really need to be more transparent in that data reporting. It doesn't harm. We want to protect individuals' privacy, but we need families to have the power of understanding the data. It's the same thing we talk about all the time. If you don't have data that you can understand and apply to making decisions, you are being deprived of the opportunity to make a good decision. So that was an important piece of legislation that did go through. That was something that I co-patroned. So that's kind of a review of all of that. Let me tell you about some other aspects of the session as we went through it. There was a lot of information about police reform. And I want to say that I supported some of that legislation. I think it's good to make sure training takes into consideration that we all have biases. We do that in medicine all the time. There's not a piece of medical literature that we publish that doesn't have a paragraph in there that talks about what our bias may have been to throw that off. It is human nature. We all need to be aware and own our biases, because we don't even realize they're there, but because future behavior is predicated on past behavior, you have an experience in the past that may bias you. We need to all own that. I support that education. I think that's important and good. But a lot of this wasn't really about police reform, because in order to reform our police, we need to make sure we know where their challenges are. And we based decisions in Virginia on things that had never happened in Virginia. And I have a problem with that. Do you know that 18 police officers have left the Richmond Police Department already and gone to other police departments because they are so stressed and dissatisfied with their job? We want to have a well-equipped, well-informed, well-educated, engaged, community service-oriented police department. And we need to make sure that the legislation that we carry and that we sponsor helps perpetuate that and not undermine that. And I think some of the stuff we did undermined that. When you looked at that legislation, and let me see if I can get to that page, we had the number of bills that were presented. Sorry, I know this would be cumbersome for me to find. The number of police-related bills were 46, and 16 of them passed. The one that I probably have the biggest issue with is the one on civilian review boards. And the reason I have an issue with that is the way they constructed the board. I believe in collaboration, participation, and having a voice for the community in how policing is done. I really think we can do a better job with that. I think that the police departments will engage in that. Just as an example, in the hospital, we have patient advisory boards. And you know who we put on those boards? We put on those boards the people who had a bad experience at the hospital. And we do that on purpose because we want to constructively make it better. But we want to engage with them. We don't want to isolate them. We don't want to separate them. We want them to be a part of improvement. I highly endorse that. The civilian review boards, though, that were passed in this special session don't exactly do that. They instead replace the internal review process of the police. I believe professionals need to have other professionals review them because they best understand the standards to which they need to be held, the policies and procedures that are required for their function. And I believe that there ought to be an internal oversight with subject matter experts that can review other police and make sure they're performing well, to be complemented by a civilian review board, but not replaced by them. And if you have a civilian review board, the way it's been constructed in Virginia, and it is permissive, and I did support that, the House wanted to make these mandatory. The Senate stood their ground and made sure that they were permissive, so localities can choose to set these up. But these not only have subpoena power, which is incredibly unusual across the country to have subpoena power in a civilian review board, but they have no law enforcement experts on them at all. In fact, you cannot be employed by law enforcement. You can be retired, but you cannot be anybody in the law enforcement community and actually be on the civilian review board. This just doesn't make sense. This is taking a good idea of how we can make Virginia better, participative conversations, and turning it into something that is unlikely to result in improved outcomes. So that's why I had a problem with that. Some other things I had a problem with. I think there's some things we could have done to protect Virginia from some of the things we've seen nationally. If you look at Minneapolis, you look at many of the other incidents, go look them up, and we've done this research in our office. Incidents that have happened that make us all just want to dissolve in despair, like Mr. Floyd's death, happened in police departments where they had collective bargaining. And that's different than Virginia for now. Collective bargaining legislation passed in the last session. It too is permissive. Localities can decide whether or not they want collective bargaining. But collective bargaining is a way by which, instead of a police department having a contract with one police officer, they have a contract with a union. That union then has the say in how that contract is implemented and what the aspects are in that contract that affect employment. So the man who killed Mr. Floyd had actually been brought up on complaints and concerns multiple times in his police department, defended by the police union, and never fired. In Virginia, he would have been fired because we hold police officers accountable. We are actually better than collective bargaining in Virginia with our level of accountability because it's individualized and it's a high standard. Can we do better? Yes. And we made some changes in this session, like making sure bad police officers that are asked to leave the police department or are fired actually lose their credentials to practice anywhere else. So that's a good change. But collective bargaining is a seriously bad one, because you remove direct accountability for actions and misbehavior, and you turn it over to your bureaucracy that tends to buffer and protect bad police officers. And in fact, the national data from lots of different academic institutions show that the highest levels of police brutality and shootings are in police divisions that have collective bargaining. We carried legislation to remove collective bargaining for police divisions in Virginia this year. That is a truly constructive thing that is evidence-based, that would have improved the outcome of police reform, and it was killed. There are other things that I think we need to be doing in justice reform, but I don't want to carry this on too long. I want to talk a little bit about budget stuff. I'm really proud of one budget amendment that I worked on and advocated for my constituents on, and that is with estheticians. So when we opened up to phase 3 in Virginia, the only license that is controlled by the state government, except for boxing, that was not allowed to practice was estheticians. This is about 4,500 employees who are on the lower level of income. These are people who are taking care of their families that were deprived the opportunity to actually work. Why they were singled out, I have no idea. But we were able to put in legislation that will produce guidelines for them to be able to practice and still keep a mask covering the patient while they're providing their services, keeping them shielded if the mask is ever removed, which is pretty much in keeping with the rest of services that are being provided. And I think that's really good, and I'm so glad we could advocate for them so that they have a chance to get back to work and have that financial health for their families. Many other things in the budget were good. Some of the things that we've already talked about that were funded in the budget made it so that I couldn't support it, but I support that we covered costs for mental health services. We need to make sure. I have had so many different members of my community step forward and say, I can't get in to get a mental health provider for my child. So we made sure that funding was available to make sure that that was more accessible. We ensured that there was mortgage relief, that there was rent relief for both owners of rental units as well as the people who were living there. We made sure that people who had bad credit reports because of rent issues during COVID didn't have that go against their financial records when they applied in the future. So there were lots of good things. It's kind of a long list to go through right now, but we're going to have a Facebook Live, and I'm going to go over all of this stuff in more detail and answer your questions. And I'm happy to answer questions on specific bills and other things, because there's a lot more to talk about than I was able to talk, and I already know this is too long. But I thank you for watching. I thank you for giving me a chance to tell you a little bit about what I tried to do to carry what I've heard from you as the message to the other people that were voting in the Senate. And I'm very grateful to support and to be able to represent you there. So thank you so much. We'll go over this again, and I'm looking forward to Facebook Live and giving you all an update then. Bye.